On June 17, 1775, General William Howe formed up his light infantry and grenadiers on a narrow beach beside the Mystic River. Regiments that had beaten France's finest at Minden, veterans of a dozen European battlefields. Howe expected to walk around the American left flank in minutes. What his men found instead was a scavenged rail fence, packed with hay and stone, held by a regiment that had not existed 8 weeks earlier. A militia unit the British had dismissed as farmers with muskets. So how did an unpaid regiment, thrown together overnight by a sawmill operator with no rank and no orders, stop the King's own light infantry cold on an open beach? By the spring of 1775, New Hampshire had no standing army, no war department, and no formal call-up system. Colonial militia law existed on paper and nowhere else. When shots rang out at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, there was no mechanism, none, to answer them. Boston itself sat garrisoned by full British regiments: the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers, the 4th King's Own, the 5th Northumberland, the 10th, the 38th, the 43rd, the 52nd, plus Royal Marines. Professional, uniformed, provision soldiers backed by the most dominant military machine on Earth. Against that, the colonies had scattered militia companies whose performance, by most accounts, was spotty at best. One later count found that 300 to 400 men who showed up at Bunker Hill worked on the fortifications but never actually got into position to fight. Numbers on paper meant nothing. Speed, positioning, and discipline meant everything, and almost nobody had all three. Tensions had been building toward this moment for years. The Boston Tea Party in 1773, the coercive acts that followed, and a raid the previous December on Fort William and Mary in Newcastle, New Hampshire, where colonists had already seized British gunpowder and munitions months before a single shot was fired at Lexington. Everyone could feel where this was heading. Almost nobody had a plan for what to do the moment it actually started. Almost nobody. Because 27 miles from Boston, in the mill town of Derryfield, there was a 46-year-old sawmill operator who was about to prove that a functioning army doesn't have to be built. Sometimes it just has to be reactivated. His name was John Stark, and what made him dangerous wasn't obvious. On the morning of April 20th, 1775, he was standing at his sawmill in his work clothes, cutting lumber, when a rider came up the road with news of the shooting at Lexington. Most tradesmen in his position would have needed days to organize anything. Stark needed hours. 23 years earlier, as a young fur trapper, he'd been captured by Abenaki warriors and marched nearly 300 miles to a village near Quebec. Forced to run the gauntlet, he refused to be beaten quietly. He grabbed a warrior's own rod out of his hands and fought back. An act of open defiance the Abenaki respected rather than punished further. He survived that captivity, came home, and later became second in command of an entire network of ranger companies under Major Robert Rogers during the French and Indian War. For 18 years, that network sat dormant. Farmers, millers, trappers, men who had once trusted Stark with their lives in the woods, now scattered across New Hampshire, living ordinary lives. British officers looked at colonial militia and saw undisciplined amateurs. What they couldn't see was that under the surface of farmers with muskets, an entire chain of command was still fully intact, just waiting for someone to switch it back on. Stark understood something the British refused to accept. A militia doesn't have to be built from strangers. It can be built from men who already trust you. He didn't spend April 20th persuading anyone. He spent it riding south and reactivating a network that had never actually gone away. He didn't even stop to change his clothes at first. He went home, armed himself, mounted his horse, and rode toward Boston, calling for volunteers as he passed through town after town, telling them to meet him at Medford, just outside the city. Word moved faster than any government courier could have managed, because it wasn't traveling through official channels. It was traveling through 18 years of personal reputation. Men who'd served under him in the Rangers didn't need convincing. They dropped their tools and followed. In Epsom, a farmer named Andrew McClary left his spring plowing the instant he heard, and by 1 o'clock that same afternoon had gathered roughly 80 local volunteers of his own. His company covered 27 miles in 6 hours, then marched through the night to cover 70 miles by sunrise. A separate company from Nottingham, 60 men strong, covered 27 miles by dusk, having run rather than marched, then somehow reached Cambridge, 55 miles from home, within 20 hours. This wasn't one man's ride. It was a chain reaction spreading across an entire colony in real time. By the time Stark reached Medford, what had started as a rough estimate of 400 men had very nearly doubled, swelling to almost 800, organized into 12 companies, the single largest regiment facing the British anywhere outside Boston. The men themselves, with no government official present to appoint anyone, voted unanimously to make Stark their colonel, with Isaac Wyman as lieutenant colonel and Andrew McClary as major. New Hampshire's government made it official 3 days later. But the regiment had already elected its own command structure before the paperwork existed. Proof that this wasn't an army built from the top down. It built itself from the bottom up in under 24 hours. For 8 weeks after that, Stark's regiment trained while the siege of Boston settled into a tense stalemate. Then, on the night of June 16th, colonial forces began fortifying Breed's Hill under cover of darkness, and by morning, the British could see the earthworks from across the harbor. General Gage and his officers prepared their response, an assault the following afternoon that they fully expected to end quickly. Stark and Colonel Reed's regiments were called up to reinforce the position, and here is where the character of this unit showed itself again. Crossing the exposed Charlestown Neck under direct artillery fire from HMS Lively, other American units hesitated and broke stride. Stark's men did not. Witnesses reported his column crossed calmly at a walking pace, refusing to give the British gunners the satisfaction of a panicked run. When Stark arrived at the battlefield, Colonel Prescott, who commanded the overall position, gave him something almost unheard of in a formal army: total discretion to deploy however he judged best. Stark walked the ground himself and immediately spotted the problem nobody else had solved. On the American left, where the fortified hills sloped down toward a beach along the Mystic River, there was a gap, a stretch of open shoreline completely undefended. If the British found it, they could pour troops around the flank, get behind the entire American position, and turn an orderly battle into a total rout. Stark moved his men there immediately. His troops threw together a defensive line out of a rail fence, packing it with hay and loose stone for whatever cover it could provide, stretching roughly 600 feet along the shore. Then Stark did something that turned vague legend into quantified military doctrine. He walked out in front of the fence and drove a stake into the ground at almost exactly 100 feet, the effective range of colonial muskets. His order to the men was blunt: nobody fires before the British reach that stake. Reportedly, he told them plainly that if any man fired early, he would knock the man down himself. Each soldier had been issued a single flint, a small charge of powder, and 15 musket balls. 15 shots. No resupply. No reserve line behind them. Everything they had to make count in the first few volleys, at a distance close enough to guarantee it. 2 pieces of artillery were brought up to reinforce the fence line, and Stark walked the position one final time before the assault began, checking each company's footing on ground that shifted from packed sand to loose stone in places, making sure no man would have to break formation to keep his balance when the moment came. On the other side of that beach stood General William Howe, a commander whose reputation had been built on exactly the kind of professional confidence the Empire prized. His light infantry and grenadiers were veterans, drilled and disciplined, men who had faced down France's armies at Minden. General Thomas Gage, watching the deployments from Boston, is reported to have said that if John Stark himself was with the rebels, they would fight, for he was a brave fellow. Practically the only acknowledgement any senior British officer gave that this particular colonial unit might be different from the rest. Howe didn't share the concern. He sent his elite light infantry down the narrow beach in tight column formation, specifically because he judged this flank the weakest point in the entire American line, the place where an amateur militia, forced into open ground with no real fortification, would break the fastest. What happened next unfolded in minutes. Across the water, the town of Charlestown was already burning, sending a column of black smoke thousands of feet into the June sky, visible for miles. The constant crack of musket fire and cannon rolling across the whole peninsula. Howe's column advanced along the beach in the packed, disciplined formation that had worked against every enemy they'd faced in Europe. Shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, boots hitting the same wet sand Stark's men had marked with a wooden stake days before. Behind the rail fence, colonial soldiers who had been farmers and mill workers 8 weeks earlier watched the distance close, watched their own officers hold their fire against every instinct in their bodies, watched the red line of uniforms pass the 200-foot mark, the 150-foot mark, closer, closer, until the front rank of the British column crossed Stark's stake. The volley that followed hit the tightly packed column at nearly point-blank range, all at once, from men who had rationed every one of their 15 shots specifically for this moment. The beach in front of the fence was suddenly a wall of falling men. The column, built for maximum shock effect in open field combat, had no room to spread out on the narrow shoreline and no cover to take from it. Howe's officers tried to reform the line for a second push. The volleys kept coming, disciplined and steady, reload after reload. Within minutes, the assault on that flank had been shattered and driven back, the survivors scrambling away from a beach that had turned into a killing ground nobody in the British command had prepared for. Historians still double-check these numbers because they sound almost invented. Total colonial casualties across the entire battle came to roughly 450, with 138 killed. Most of those losses happening later, during the retreat from the hill, not at the rail fence itself. British losses, by comparison, were dramatically higher, with numerous officers among the dead, and by several credible accounts, the fighting at Stark's stretch of fence alone accounted for close to half of every British soldier killed in action that day. A single stone and hay barrier, built in a few hours by a regiment that had been recruited in a single night, inflicted more damage on the British Empire's professional infantry than almost anywhere else on that entire battlefield. The ripple effect went well beyond one afternoon. Bunker Hill is remembered as a technical British victory only in the narrowest sense. They took the hill, but at a cost so severe it fundamentally changed how the war was fought. British commanders became far more cautious about launching direct frontal assaults against fortified colonial lines for the rest of the conflict. And the losses at Bunker Hill were a direct factor in Britain's decision to hire large numbers of Hessian troops to bolster its numbers going forward. This is the same underlying principle a century later on the other side of the world, when Boer commandos in southern Africa, ordinary farmers required by law to keep a horse, a rifle, and ammunition ready at a moment's notice, electing their own officers exactly the way Stark's men had, used that same rapid, self-armed mobilization to defeat British forces decisively at Majuba Hill in 1881. Different continents, different centuries, the same discovery. An army built on reactivated trust can move faster than one built on formal structure. And speed, more than size, decides who gets to be in position when it matters. The lesson Stark's regiment leaves behind is a simple one, and it applies well past the battlefield. The fastest response to a crisis rarely comes from building something new. It comes from reactivating relationships and trust that were already there, waiting. Stark himself went on to fight at Trenton and Princeton under Washington, resigned his commission in 1777 after being passed over for a promotion he'd earned in favor of officers with better political connections, and was then recalled 2 years after Bunker Hill to lead New Hampshire's militia to another decisive win at Bennington, the battle that 3 decades later produced the toast he's now best remembered for: live free or die. He lived to be 94 years old, the last surviving general of the entire Continental Army. Today, Stark is remembered with statues in Manchester and Concord, New Hampshire, and at the Bennington Battle Monument in Vermont. But notably, no statue of him was ever completed at Bunker Hill itself, the one battlefield his instincts arguably saved. Andrew McClary, who helped build that overnight regiment and fought the entire battle at Stark's side, survived the fighting completely unscathed, only to walk back onto the empty battlefield afterward, alone, to check on British movements one last time, and was killed instantly by a stray cannon shot on his way back, the final casualty of the entire battle. His actual grave in Medford, Massachusetts, has been lost to history. There is no marker. As recently as 2025 and 2026, archaeologists excavating the original redoubt on Breed's Hill with modern ground-penetrating radar recovered musket balls and gun flints from that same battle layer, and discovered that the fortification, thrown up in that same desperate overnight rush, was a far more deliberately engineered structure than 250 years of assumption had given it credit for. The men who built it in a single frantic night, it turns out, were more disciplined than anyone believed. Much like the regiment that held the beach beside them. If you're getting something out of stories like this, the ones where the side everyone underestimated turns out to be the side that was actually ready, we cover forgotten weapons and tactical history like this every single week, so it might be worth sticking around for the next one.